The theme for this afternoon is the purpose of education, and I have three distinguished scholars to help me with this. So initially I'd like to make a few remarks and then we'll go from there. To start with, maybe I might give you a little bit about my own background because that involved a process of re-education in itself. In that, my basic background is in technology, engineering and management. And I was involved in professions and a career for almost 30 years in that field, in various capacities in terms of electronic, electromechanical manufacturing company. And then subsequently, for the last 15 to 18 years, is when I guess I would say that I went through a phase of re-education, in that I had the opportunity to work at and with and in the Foundation for the Future in Bellevue, Washington, that was endowed by my colleagues. And the theme or the mission of the foundation was to increase and diffuse knowledge concerning the future of humanity, a rather ambitious charter. But in the process of doing so, personally, and again, it might seem like I'm dropping names, but forgive me, but in the process of working through the different activities of the program, activities in the programs of the foundation that I was in charge of, I had the opportunity to personally interact with and have conversation with and learn from mostly eminent people like Ed Wilson, the creator of sociobiology, Erich, who wrote the classic text that's used in every astronomy classroom about the epic of evolution, Brian Fagan, who is one of the world's most famous cultural anthropologists, who has written about 50 books talking about the anthropology, the cultural anthropology of various civilizations. I even had the opportunity to discuss memes with Richard Dawkins and vital dust. In other words, the fact that we and the stars are made of the same stuff as originally scientifically established by Christian Beidou and his book subsequently called The Vital Dust. And then again, New York University. These are among a few of the names, just to point out what kind of a variety that I had the opportunity and good fortune to interact with. And one of the others was Professor Michio Kaku, who is a string theorist at the New York University, who has written extensively about vision, and in the context of visions, discussing the fact that humans have to make a transition from type 0 to type 1 if we are to survive, and the distinction from type 0 to type 1 being how we harness the resources of the planet in terms of its energy needs, and then transition into the planetary system and how we go about colonizing it, if you wish. So given that, I've already talked about thinking about the future in terms of that complex matrix that I explained prior, where the three axes are the various political, cultural, economic, social systems that are on one axis, individuals in their multiple identities dealing with these systems or as being part of those systems, operating within the larger environment of the planet insofar as all of the multiple spheres, the atmosphere, the geosphere, the zoosphere, the biosphere, and again taking the liberty of introducing, if I might, the context or the element of spiritual aspect, where Pierre de Chardin describes it as the noosphere in his classic book, The Phenomenon of Man, where rather than humans having descended from divinity, are ascending towards divinity in terms of what he describes as omega point. So now let's get right to the bottom of, or to the very basic of what I believe or what I think, in a very elementary sense, the purpose of education is. Let me start there, and then I'll try to fill in insofar as where we go from here. To me, the purpose of education is to essentially enable us to understand who we are, how are we related to everyone else in the planet, and all the other elements that we interact with on the planet, which is the biosphere, the geosphere, and so on, with the specific objective of meeting needs. And again, not to oversimplify, but I simply chose to use Maslow insofar as articulating the hierarchy of needs that essentially determine what it is that we are pursuing by way of education or any other endeavor. And that hierarchy of needs starts with the physiological, then the safety needs, then the love needs, the esteem needs, and the self-actualization needs of humans. So in that sense, that is the hierarchy. So to what extent does education, as we pursue it, make us understand the relationships that I described and the objectives that we seek to meet? Which is, to me, it's keeping it as simple as possible. Now, what has happened insofar as the nature and content of education in terms of what we see as of today? And so with that in mind, let me point out a couple of things. A lot has already been said about the fact that we have generated knowledge over the past within silos, whether it's physics or chemistry or biology or mathematics or calculus, whatever the subject might be, or social sciences or political science. But the fact of the matter, as he laments, is we have in a sense lost the Renaissance concept of education that used to exist, but then have made education subservient to the needs of a paradigm, which I will describe a little bit later, essentially where we have lost the concept of the unity of learning, insofar as the complex interconnections between the various disciplines. As Ed Wilson points out, in education, the search for consilience is the way to renewing the clumbling structure of liberal arts. During the past 30 years, the ideal of the unity of learning, which the Renaissance and Enlightenment bequeathed to us, has been largely abandoned. Or Noam Chomsky, people have the idea that from childhood, young people have to be placed into a framework where they are going to follow orders. This is often quite explicit. So that basically has been the substance or the content of education at whatever level they might have been designed in order to implement. And if you want to put it in this way, essentially brainwashing to be subservient to the needs of whatever the entities might be that are dictating as to what needs to occur. And to that extent, what used to be in the old days involuntary, uncompensated slavery, we have moved to education, meeting the needs of those that are interested in achieving objectives, to voluntary paid slavery. To that extent, the exercise of our creative imaginations and our minds insofar as understanding other things have essentially been shunted. And I'll show you a little bit later as to what Professor Wilson talks about in his rather famous book called Consilience. Consilience essentially meaning jumping together of the various disciplines of knowledge and the emotional, passionate plea he makes for changing education to go back to that model of consilience as the basis of education. Now, one other thing that has happened in the process is, insofar as recent times, more exacerbated as to what I will describe as the closing of our minds. Closing of our minds insofar as being participants in society, the need for political correctness has required us to be able to think about, to talk about, and discuss things with some criteria in mind, and essentially they are sort of described in the following, most of which, if you think in terms of knowledge and hoping to attain knowledge in the strict sense of the term, is stunted or obstructed even, or actually bypassed and even nullified. And these are some of the principles that I'm sure you would recognize operationally in most of our societies now. One of them being the fundamental principle, which is those who know the truth should decide who is right. So if you are now in the clutches of a fundamentalist mind, whether it be of the religious kind or of the scientific kind or whatever kind, basically they tell you what the truth is, and therefore they have the right to decide who is right. The second principle being the simple egalitarian principle, which is all sincere persons' beliefs have equal claims to respect, no matter how stupid their pronouncements about whatever the subject might be. As you think back, you will see that in our own societies, a lot of this is operational on a very active and aggressive basis, and getting worse by the day. So the radical egalitarian principle is similar to the egalitarian principle, but the beliefs of persons in historically oppressed classes or groups get special consideration. So objectivity, taking into account situations that currently exist, are to be ignored, but historically oppressed groups have to be given special attention in terms of their proclamations about what they know or what they think is right, and therefore respect that opinion no matter, again, how stupid that might be. And finally, the humanitarian principle, which is any of the above with the condition that the first priority is to cause no hurt, which is you cannot disagree with somebody for fear of emotionally or mentally upsetting their feelings to the point where all you have to do is say something silly and they agree and you get along perfectly well. But ideally, the only principle that has actually generated and is relevant and valid for pursuing knowledge or education is the liberal principle, which is an aspect of which would be the scientific method, but essentially saying through public criticism, checking who is right by way of dialogue, in terms of conversation, in terms of proof, in terms of evidence, and so on and so forth. So this is something to keep in mind when you observe a system of education, to what extent these principles are dominating the discourse as it relates to how someone is educated. So, now, we have had a lot of conversation about paradigms. I am going to make an attempt to describe what I believe are 4 major paradigms that have been the basis around which or within which we have evolved, and that's the important point I want to make, within which we have evolved to the present. The first one is what I will call the divine creation paradigm. One thing I want to point out here is that none of these paradigms have been replaced by the succeeding one. It is simply each paradigm is overlaid by the succeeding paradigm and on to where we have now currently on the onset of the 4th paradigm that I will try to describe. The first being divine creation as the basis for how we get educated or we know what we know. For instance, some of the basic principles of this paradigm was that the earth is flat, that it's 6,000 years old, right? And that the earth, the sun revolved around the earth. And we know of great minds in the past who have been either executed or put in jail for proclaiming the opposite. Well, slowly, in a sense, even though it has not gone away, some of the elements, as in terms of these kinds of beliefs, have been given up, but the basic divine creation paradigm is still very much in vogue, insofar as how we have come to be where we are, who created us, and so on, and what the relationship between us and the divine and each other is. The second paradigm, which again overlays the first one, is what I will describe as the paradigm of evolution. Evolution, insofar as it relates to the idea that it is a selection for fitness. And it's not just in the realm of humans that the evolutionary paradigm has been operating, but by virtue of the fact that, again, I go back here to refer to Professor Yong-Seung, who has written this classic about the ethical evolution, where he describes 7 major stages as it relates to the evolutionary paradigm. Of course, starting with the Big Bang, then the particulate stage, the galactic stage, the stellar stage, the chemical stage, the biological stage, the cultural stage, and the last one that he has described, which puts us in today's context, which is the ethical evolution stage. So what this represents basically is the fact that evolution has been at work from the beginning of the Big Bang, if we so acknowledge. And it is entirely conceivable that without actually challenging, because you get into the question of what caused the Big Bang ad infinitum regressively. So let us assume that for the moment, even though I personally am not willing to concede it, that the divine creation principle, as some are beginning to insist, still holds. And that divine creation principle is articulated in the form of what we now know today, presumably as a science, is intelligent creator. The intelligence principle, meaning what we see around us insofar as structure and organization and hierarchy and perfection and interrelationship between the components are so perfect, are so good. For instance, the various parameters that hold this planet together are exactly of a certain measurement to where any variation in that we wouldn't exist. And the idea being that it represents intelligent design, therefore there must be an intelligent designer, which, depending on your inclination as to what faith you belong to, that is the God who is the intelligent designer. But I don't really want to get into the debate, because there's a lot of debate about the hoax that this science of intelligent design is. It depends on who you talk to. The third paradigm, again, overlaid on the first two, again, keep in mind that where we are at, situated insofar as humans on the planet as a species, is between cultural evolution and ethical evolution. Cultural evolution, again, essentially being manifested or represented by selection for fitness of means. Means being packets of ideas. Insofar as evolution is concerned, one thing to also keep in mind is that there is neither purpose nor direction insofar as strictly pure interpretations of this process. It is simply an outcome based on the success of a set of ideas that have managed to survive. So, in that sense, an example I often give is, if you go to any street corner in the world or any major city, you will find McDonald's, or Kentucky Fried Chicken, or Domino's Pizza. One would have to agree and acknowledge that it has been an exceptionally successful move. We may have all kinds of arguments and questions about whether it is good or bad, but the fact that it has survived and spread is in itself a representation of the success of that move. So now, insofar as cultural evolution is concerned, in that stage has evolved what I would state, or what has been described, as the Baconian paradigm. I referred to it a little while earlier. The Baconian paradigm essentially is an outcome of Francis Bacon, who articulated it. I don't know exactly when he lived. I'm sure Ivo would be qualified to tell me as to exactly when he lived.
Elizabeth, the age of Elizabeth.
Elizabeth. And what were the basic postulates of the Baconian paradigm? First of all, recall that he was a scientist. And the power and impetus for the scientific method got its motivation from Francis Bacon and those around him. So one of the primary requirements of this paradigm was the use of science to understand the world around us. The second aspect of this was that it was required, whether by divine sanction or by our own motivation, that we need to understand the world around us via the scientific method. The third dictum of this paradigm was that the idea, the purpose behind having the science and knowing the world around us is for purposes of progress. Progress that is infinite, progress that is linear, and therefore absolutely essential that we pursue the notion of progress. We'll talk a little bit about what the consequences of this paradigm have been insofar as what we face today. The fourth one, and this is where a lot of conversation is now taking place, is the idea that we are at a point in our evolution where we need to think in terms of what might seem like an oxymoron or a contradiction, which is conscious evolution. In other words, not denying the fact of evolving, but the fact that we as humans have an input to it. Conscious evolution. And here some of the principles of new science have become important and have come into play, some of them being, I don't know if you're familiar with the popular book that Malcolm Gladwell wrote recently about tipping points. Another one is about self-organization, which is gaining a lot of currency. To give you a small example of what I mean by self-organization, take a multi-lane highway. Essentially, all we know is that there are lanes on either side of the traffic and cars by the thousands on that road, but nobody is dictating exactly how one gets to their destination insofar as making decisions instantly as to which lane you should be in, or whether you should stop, or whether you should accelerate. Other than the boundary within which you are functioning, it is almost exactly an exercise in self-organization where an individual motivated by the need to get somewhere gets there by virtue of being on that highway, making conscious choices on an instantaneous basis, but the traffic in its entirety gets organized by itself. The third principle that we are beginning to get to is the idea that, as who pointed that out, yes, I believe it was Ivo, is that, or I think actually Gary, where we have been operating under the assumption that everything is linear. But actually, almost everything we know around us is non-linear. Insofar as, for instance, the most famous example given is about the butterfly that flaps its wings and you see a tornado, in an exaggerated sense to illustrate the point. You see a tornado at some distant point in time, which cannot be predicted. You don't know what the impact of it is, but where it will occur, but eventually a butterfly flapping its wings creates the tornado at some point in time in the future. So when you look at these principles, maybe what we can do, as I tried to explain in my earlier comment, as to how the future actually comes about. If I have time, maybe I'll try and quickly go through this. Imagine a flat surface, any one of these flat surfaces, and temporarily I'm kind of going to create a circumstance where what you put on that flat surface sticks to it. Even though initially, because of the flatness of the surface and whatever the smoothness of it is, whatever is put on it may slip off or fall, and let's allow for that too. So now visualize 7 billion human beings, soon to be 9.5, and some say 12, as these grains of sand that are providing inputs to that flat surface. At, as I described, different locations, different identities, operating under the influence of different systems. So if you were to take the geography of that flat surface and imagine multiple points of inputs of grains of sand through that flat surface, depending upon the rate at which that input is occurring and the variations as to conditions in each of those locations, you will see critical masses emerging as to the contour of a pipe all over the flat surface. And if the process were to continue ad infinitum, what you end up then is two neighboring contours merging. And if you take the thought experiment to its ultimate end, it eventually creates a single pipe. So the idea of the future, now going back to what I've been trying to say, is to think of individual inputs as a flat inputs as grains of sand to a flat surface, creating contours and localities, merging into neighboring localities, and eventually emerging in some form as to a final contour which is the outcome of our original inputs. So when we think in terms of humans and the purpose of education, let me share a few thoughts along the same lines. So here is Henry Morris, essentially talking about the fact that there are fluctuations, there are dynamics, there is rhythms, there are patterns, and all of that kind of interconnected in a complex sense to create the outcomes that we see. And then this is another important. I've had the personal, wonderful experience of meeting Professor James Lovelock and his book Gaia, basically talking about the fact that the planet is an operating system with fine-tuned parts interacting with each other, and our part in it is one not above and above, over and above it. And so recognizing this might be the underlying basis for an education that will help us cure our ills. Here is something that the old sages used to tell us all the time, but we seem to have forgotten, is the fact that we are not apart from nature, but belong to it, and we are one with it. And again, Alan Watts, where he's basically discounting the fact that the world is not a set of binaries, but it's much more complex than that. Good can exist with evil, pain and pleasure, not all. And this is again John Barrow, another famous physicist, talking about the fact that it's a totality, it's holistic, and that a lot of the Eastern philosophies had these ideas centuries, if not thousands of years ago. It's not that they were misguided, as we used to think, but maybe premature. Because if we were to think in terms of consilience, coming back to education, here is a diagram that Professor Wilson draws about, we were discussing this earlier, as to whether, when we think in terms of the sciences that we pursue today, the silos individually are environmental, ethics, biology, and social science. But in terms of addressing real issues, you cannot separate them in those silos. Rather, you have to think in terms of them as complex, interacting phenomena that we need to have some understanding about if we are to be successful in addressing these issues. So again, coming back to the very basic idea that we are thinking in terms of education for the future would require the acknowledgement that we need two basic requirements, two basic things. One is humans need to think in terms of a planetary identity, and secondly, ethical evolution. Ethical in the sense, and I'll get to that in a minute. And here, we've mentioned all these earlier, the balancing between the individual and the collective, which Gary pointed out, and also the fact that we are part and parcel of a complex system around us, which is the atmosphere, the biosphere, the geosphere, the zoosphere, and the noosphere. So the purpose of education need not be, at least as far as not the knowledge aspect, I'm not discounting that this applies to mathematics or physics or chemistry, but at its simplest level, the purpose of education going forward has to be the idea that we are planetary citizens, no longer can survive with narrow identities that relate to geographies or history or culture or politics or society. And a second aspect, and I'll close with that, my colleague, who is a far-sighted physicist and a thinker, used to constantly point out that humans today are the equivalent of going in a car, traveling in a car at rapid speeds down a slope without steering, without brakes, without headlights. And unless we stop and think in terms of how we are going to get control of that situation, we may not even survive. And the second example is given by Professor Calvin, who also is an evolutionary biologist at the University of Washington, who basically uses the analogy of, again, humans in some kind of a vehicle where the headlights that are there on that vehicle and the speed at which we are moving are totally out of sync, where the light, the distance that the headlight is throwing is not adequate to deal with the rapidity with which we are going down that slope. And you may call me a pessimist, but at this point, I think based on what I have understood, a lot of these scientists that or minds that I have had the wonderful opportunity of dealing with have basically pointed out, in so many respects, that climate change or water as a critical resource or the exhaustion of fossil fuels or the destruction of the ecosystem or the exhaustion of all the other resources, climate change, all these are consequences of our, how do I put it, blind following of the paradigm of progress in a linear sense that I just described. Gary did a wonderful job. I was going to use that also in terms of GDP as a measure of progress. It's probably the most distorted measurement that one could use. And there is a wonderful book, if you are interested, called The Third Curve, written by a gentleman who used to be a filmmaker, who talks about the fact that financial capital has been the basis on which we have determined everything going forward in terms of decisions. But one needs to take into account that, as again Gary pointed out, not only is financial capital important, but we have cultural capital, we have social capital, we have human capital, we have resource capital, and we have ecosystem capital, all of which are being depleted at the expense, motivated by financial capital as the only measure of progress. And finally, I would warn us that unless education is reoriented towards this notion of planetary identity and citizenship and ethical evolution going forward, as it relates to our obligations to future generations, it is a well-known principle in evolution that 99.9% of all that ever existed is extinct. And right now, scientists are describing, at least in the last several weeks I've already read, that we now are actively in the 6th stage of mass extinction. And humans are not exempt. Thank you.
One of which you mentioned a voluntary paid slavery. I mean, I thought that was very useful to remind us that we are voluntary paid slavery and the closing of our mind. Just a few comments. You mentioned that 30 years ago we lost the unity of learning. And I believe that something around 1970, between the 70s and to the 80s, we've lost quite a lot. We've lost gold as a base for the US dollar. And we lost growth to enter a field of growth has been fueled by debt. So we've lost lots of things in the 70s and the 80s, and we pay the bill right now. Our currency has no value. Our educational system have lost the unity of learning, as you said, and I think this is absolutely awful. I just wanted to go back to a few points that were to be explored in the topic's landmark, like what are the main social objectives education serves in society today, and what are the main learning objectives of education today. I really loved your presentation because it's the purpose of education that we can foresee. But what do we have today? I believe that education is a purposeless system. If we go back to why we have universities, it's just because there were monasteries and theological education, and the tradesmen wanted to be able to have their own way of educating people without the religion. So it's an opportunistic element. There has never been any purpose to serve the society. It's an opportunistic reaction to a power. And there has never been any purpose in any system beside maintaining the power of one group of people to another group of people. So that's one comment. This is a purposeless, a posteriori system. And it becomes a standardizing process to maintain that power. And for me, education is the best cultural Trojan horse that ever existed. Because you format kids to a way that they will conform in a system that is exactly designed to maintain a power in place. So what are the values that any system wants to make sure you keep? Obeisance, conformity, ranking, you know, because if you start ranking people, you compare them and you make 99% of the guys really ashamed. They are losers. And 1% are the winners. Does that sound familiar with any criticism of the capitalist society? It's 1%, 99%? Because the 1% became the teachers of the future 99%. So it's really a system that keeps surviving and surviving and surviving. And honestly, when is the best time ever in education? It's just when it starts. You know? It's like end of June, beginning of July, and everybody can burn everything. That's the best time in education. The rest of it is a torture. It's a real torture, which has a single point, which is accepting life as a suffering. And there are many other traditions that refuse that life is a suffering. And instead of maximizing profit, there are other ways to think and to say, no, we have to minimize suffering. So instead of having a purposeless system that is just evolving for the sake of 1%, torturing the 99%, promoting obeisance, conformity, and standardization of thinking, why can't we think of something else? Something that would make us happy, healthy, creative. And I'd like to stop here.
Education should be the development of the individual personality in the social context. I think the social context may be derived from needs, as you mentioned now, but I think it's also produced. We have many needs we are seeing now, for example, in the consumption. They are produced. It's not our needs we have internally, they are produced. But what is more important is what do I mean by individual personality. I think it's out of three components. One is thinking, the next one is emotions, and the third one, the will. A person exists of these three dimensions, and altogether can be called it's the wisdom we discussed already this morning. So education should enhance the wisdom of the whole personality. The second point is the general learning objective to arrive at the development of a personality should recur to the classical enlightenment. Classical enlightenment begins already with Bacon, and to refer to the French parallel theory from Descartes. You know, this is just linear. I think this kind of enlightenment doesn't help much, but we have many other enlightenment theories, beginning from the Scottish Enlightenment to the French Enlightenment. I remember we have already spoken about Smith, Locke, Hobbes. In France, Voltaire, Rousseau, and many others. And I may add also the theory of Immanuel Kant in the German-speaking area. And for those people, reason was the central argument for the development of the personality. So it's the thinking mainly, and the rationality in the sense of the reason, enlightened reason, which was the promotion to develop an individual personality. I think this is very important if we want to develop a paradigm or something of a paradigm to connect it with this older theories in the second part of the 17th century and beginning and until the 19th century. Because in my view, I think we should not build some theory without relying on these Enlightenment theories. They have certainly been to be enriched by modern theories, which I do not know so much than the Enlightenment theories. But a few years ago, we had a conference in Podgorica, and there were very interesting contributions to the aspects of modern society, which modify in a certain way the classical Enlightenment theories. The next point is education should be a process, and this is what we call as the lifelong learning. Growingly important are the educations at the very early years until the aged people. And we have, for example, in the European Union, conceptually 5 stages for the development of a person and to keep them according to the needs, their needs and the needs of the society, educated until very old. They are very old. Until 75, there is still the latest stage of the lifelong learning circle. And I think this should also be taken into account. The experience, especially with this adult education, which could contribute to the development of some kind of paradigm or things like this. Finally, education has to be human-centered. It has been said already many times here in this morning. And I think Gary has contributed already to an important extent to develop some kind of human-centered education concept. But I will refer also to Amartya Sen, you know, the theory of capability, which in my view is, especially from the view of from the economic system, it's really a good composition because he has 3 kind of educational activities where the capability should be developed. It's the social context, it's the working context, and it's also political context. For example, democracy is a very important value, and I think this should be taken into account and may enrich what I have at the beginning defined of the development of the individual personality in the social context. Thank you.
Thank you. First, I would like to start my comments by saying my gratefulness, deliver my gratefulness to all of you here, and me as business professor, and also a business professor who is going through sort of change of paradigm myself in my particular, the functional area of study. And I view this, change and paradigm shift in my career, and also for the general in academia, is very critical. That's my view. So as a business professor, it has been a very, valuable learning opportunity myself, and also learning from the colleagues like you from this eminent association. Going back to my own study, field of management, within UN community, there is a newly emerging secretariat called UN PRME, and PRME stands for Principles for Responsible Management Education, and more than 600 business schools worldwide joined this new sort of movement in terms of the new paradigm of management education. And within this kind of the organization, from my experience with this movement for the last 5 or 6 years, sort of I experienced, those issues that we discussed today. So once again, I'm very, this has been a wonderful learning opportunity myself. And my comments on this session, I especially liked this session because it was about purposefulness in our calling education. And I think I'm not denying the freedom of academy, the scholarship and so on and so forth, but as we are moving into this new dimension, this new dimension of education, where, as Professor Velamoor mentioned, conscious evolution is sort of regarded as a very critical dimension of that evolution. So, as we are moving into this new dimension, maybe purposefulness might be the very starting point. That is especially so when it comes to the change management issue. The change management issue is the very important subject in today's business, today's management. And when it comes to the change management, for those, if you take a look at the company cases and so on and so forth, those so-called purpose-driven companies are more likely to manage the change in successful manner. So if we are talking about this paradigm shift in education and learning, maybe it's a very good starting point to talk about purpose. What is purpose of education? And going back to the greatness of having purpose will ignite the human members within the organization or within the system. And purpose will give you with some creative solution. And with this new paradigm, change management, we may go through ups and downs and uncertainty and so on and so forth. But having this purpose will make you go through all this the uncertainty. So I think having purpose and talking about this purposefulness in education is a good idea. And my comments will be short too. And my sort of question to this session might be then from my own experience as a business professor with this in conjunction with this UN PRME movement, the experience that I had so far is that not many professors share this necessity of having this purposefulness in their education. Maybe that's because of compartmentalization of the knowledge and so on and so forth. And again, as we are moving to